A friend of mine keeps sending me recommendations for movies, and frankly, they are usually so obscure, even I don't have them in my collection, and can't even get a copy to add them to it. Today's video he sent me and my reply was, "That's a good film," and then I decided, hell to it, I deserve quality in my life occasionally, so here is Warlock, which is a 1989 American supernatural horror film directed by Steve Milner, an enjoyable low-budget witchcraft and fantasy flick that had rewrites and studio-mandated edits, then languished in release limbo for a number of years, received mixed critical reception on release, and inspired a copycat-style murder, which is probably a sensible place to start this review. In 1995, in Saskatchewan, Canada, a 14-year-old boy with the help of an 8-year-old accomplice murdered a 7-year-old in an attempt to allegedly gain the power of flight after a spirit told him to do it. This being something that is hinted at in the film more than actually shown, where we see the Warlock talking to a boy, then hear how he was mauled by a coyote, and then we see the Warlock flying, the impression being given that he killed the child then skinned him to gain the power of flight somehow. The film is very vague and gives no real concrete facts on how this works. In the initial script, the fate of the boy was meant to be shown, but was removed as part of the fairly extensive studio-mandated edits after negative test screening feedback, with it being decided it was just too gruesome. I'm going to be honest here, I think this is another example of a media-created and led outrage based on the flimsiest of evidence. Even if the murderer did claim he was inspired by the film, he was in fact found not guilty by way of insanity, and as far as I am aware spent until now in a secure hospital. The script, written by David Twohy of Waterworld and the Riddick franchise fame, initially envisaged the Warlock being a sort of religious pilgrim who flees the past to the future to escape persecution, only to be just as equally persecuted when he arrives. He was basically going to be a good-natured fish out of water character. After only a few months of working on the script, he discovered it just didn't work, so turned him into a pure antagonist, which I think was a sensible move. Rather unluckily for the production, however, this was one of the last films that New World Pictures completed before filing for Chapter 11 bankruptcy towards the end of 1988. So the film sat in release limbo until 1991, when Trimark Pictures acquired the distribution rights and gave it a theatrical run. A run that was successful enough to mean that 2 unconnected sequels were produced: Warlock the Armageddon in 1993 and 1999's Warlock 3 The End of Innocence. This might actually be one of the few film franchises where all the films in the franchise are standalone movies with no connection to each other. I can't think of any others. If you can, let me know down in the comments. As for me, well, I'd seen Warlock many times on TV back in the day and remembered it being a not particularly scary but nevertheless entertaining horror, but I'd go as far as to actually just describe as a supernatural fantasy more than anything, and on rewatching it, that's exactly what I got. We open with Julian Sands' Warlock facing execution in Boston in 1691, where everyone except the Warlock bizarrely has a Scottish accent. Is this a thing? I thought Boston was meant to be Irish, not Scottish. Anyway, he and Richard E. Grant's witch hunter character Redfern are transported via magic to 1988's LA. The Warlock crash lands through Laurie Singer's character Cassandra's living room window, then proceeds to do the only actual bits of real violence we see throughout this film, when he chops her housemate's finger off and bites his tongue off before maybe eating it off camera. That's it for actual violence in this film's whole 103-minute runtime really. Everything else is more hinted at rather than shown. Apparently this is because on initial test screenings the special effects received such negative feedback that they just cut those scenes from the movie, including a scene where the Warlock tricks a psychic into summoning Satan, who tells him to reassemble the Grand Grimoire, which is currently separated into 3 pieces. In the initial cut of the film, the devil provides his eyes to the Warlock to guide him via manifesting them onto the psychic's chest, as her nipples, with the Warlock then freezing her and stamping on her until they were freed. What we actually got was him hinting that he cut her eyes out, and then reappearing with eyeballs in his hand. The original scene as described is one of those that would genuinely have become a cult classic that people share around, discuss, and frankly cherish. I feel, but alas no, they cut it, and as far as I'm aware it doesn't even exist as an extra anywhere. The excuse that the special effects were bad is a little moot, because the effects in this film are, even taking into account the era and budget, fairly bad, or at least very uneven. Some are fairly excellent, like the Warlock's demise, and others are fairly atrocious, like in flying. I can literally see the rotoscoping, for God's sake. But never fear, because this doesn't actually affect my enjoyment of this film, because Julian Sands as the Warlock is a great presence whenever he is on screen, being both charismatic and menacing in equal measure. He's ably supported by Richard E. Grant, who is rather more of a fish out of water type character than the Warlock, and is well acted as you'd expect from someone such as Grant. Allegedly, Laurie Singer was difficult to work with and refused to wear prosthetics to really sell her aging curse. A fact that is very noticeable. It really does look like they put makeup on her face and talc in her hair to grey it up a bit to age of 20 years. Believable, it is not. But then again, I rarely find aging effects particularly effective anyway. It is actually a shame too, because she also gives a fairly decent performance as a vacuous, self-centered 80s girl who only really helps save the world because she doesn't want to get old. The narrative is fun and skips along at a decent pace, having just enough action to keep it from ever getting boring. I do wish, however, they'd kept a bit more of the violence in. It would have given it just that extra punch of entertainment for me. Other than that, I only have one more thing to say about Warlock. I often describe these low budget films as being very similar to other more famous bigger budgeted films, as it's so obvious that those are the inspiration for the lower budgeted ones. I've seen online many references to this being compared to The Terminator, but not one of those links or references actually links to a review or anybody actually saying this. There are 3 such references on Wikipedia and 2 on Rotten Tomatoes. They are either all dead links or a circle back to the Rotten Tomatoes page for Warlock. Is this some elaborate joke someone decided to play on everyone? Because other than time travel, I do not see any similarities between this and Terminator. So that was Warlock, a fun little fantasy horror that could do with a dash more graphic violence for my tastes, but is well worth a watch, as it's all beautifully underpinned by 2 mesmerising performances by its leads. If you liked that, then like, comment and subscribe, because next week I will be covering the absolute insanity that is Raw Force.